Hello everyone and welcome to today's Sutta class. We will start as usual with the Namo Tassa. Feel free to join if you like. Namo Tassa Bhagavato Arahato Samma Sambuddhassa. Namo Tassa Bhagavato Arahato Samma Sambuddhassa. Namo Tassa Bhagavato Arahato Samma Sambuddhassa. Buddhang Dhammang Sanghang Namasami. So, hello everyone and welcome to the Sutta class. Today we will continue reading the Bhayabherava Sutta, Majjhima Nikaya number 4, which is translated as fear and dread. So we will continue talking about the topic of fear. And last time we already read the first half of this sutta and we talked a bit about fear. There were also quite a few questions. So if you have more questions, just type them in the live chat, because I think today the rest of the sutta will be a little bit shorter than usual. So we have plenty of time to answer questions probably. And so last time already we talked about fear, and we noted that a lot of people are struggling a lot with fear. And fear is something, a hindrance in our mind, or a defilement in our mind that can cause a lot of suffering for many people, something that is present quite often in our mind, something we experience in daily life quite regularly, but still it's not that often talked about in the suttas. So it's not part of the usual list of the 5 hindrances. It's not part of the 3 evil roots, greed, hatred, and delusion. So it's something we struggle with a lot, but it's not that often addressed in the suttas, and that's why I wanted to read this sutta with you. And I think especially in these modern times, we are going through a period in history that seems to be quite fearful, and it seems to be that at the moment there's especially much fear present in our minds. For example, there's climate change that can cause a lot of anxiety for many people. There are the pandemics, especially now the COVID pandemic, that are going around that are causing a lot of fear, not only fear of getting sick or not only fear of dying, but all the other problems that come with it, fear of losing one's job, fear of losing one's livelihood, and then the financial security, fear of losing one's house, one's family members, all these kinds of things that are associated with the pandemic that's going on. Then new wars have started that cause a lot of anxiety for many people. And inflation is going up, prices are going up, people don't know how to survive. There's just a lot of anxiety being created at the moment, and people are worried a lot about these kind of things. So the levels of fear and the levels of anxiety at the moment are quite high compared to what we have experienced maybe a few years ago. And also, especially the pandemic has led to a lot of mental disorders. For example, social anxieties are really high now. A lot of people have a lot of trouble after being in isolation for so long and after being in lockdown, have a lot of trouble reconnecting with other people in real life, not just online through Zoom or through YouTube or through whatever online means, but actually interacting with other people face to face is now very difficult for many people. And a lot of other mental disorders have also come up because we are constantly under this stress, because we are constantly experiencing all these tensions, all this fear, and that has really caused a lot of problems, mental problems for many people. And I think also one other factor that contributes to this is the systems that we are living in are quite fear-driven. So, for example, the economic system that we live in, capitalism, usually people say it's greed-driven, but actually it's also quite fear-driven. So one message that is constantly reinforced that many people sort of constantly consumed through social media or through other media is the idea that there's not enough, that there is some kind of danger coming, so we need to buy more stuff to be prepared. So people, instead of trying to let go of the tension, let go of the stress and calm down and rely on themselves, what people are told to do is rely on material things, to buy more in order to find security in those material possessions, which obviously doesn't work. It just leads to more anxiety and leads to more stress and leads to more tension and more problems. But obviously, since our economic system is such that the companies constantly need to try and sell more and more stuff, that is one method that is quite powerful in order to get people to buy more, is to just create more fear, so that people think that they are in danger if they don't have those things, and so they will spend a lot of money buying more random stuff that they supposedly need in order to be prepared for whatever danger is going to come. So a lot of people constantly live under a lot of stress and a lot of anxiety. And so, of course, fear is something that creates a lot of suffering at the moment. And so for this reason, we have started reading the Sutta. We already read the first half. So this was a Sutta where the Buddha engages in conversation with a Brahmin called Janusoni, who was quite a famous Brahmin teacher also. And the first thing that the Brahmin asked the Buddha was whether his students actually take him as an example and follow his leadership and follow the way that he practices. And the Buddha says yes. And that seemed a little bit out of context in the beginning, but we will come back to this at the end of the sutta. So we will see that it actually integrates quite well with the rest of the sutta. And then the Brahmin started the actual topic of this discourse, and he asked the Buddha about practicing in seclusion. So obviously practicing in seclusion is a big part of Buddhist practice, going into the wilderness and trying to develop samadhi there. So deep states of concentration. And obviously it's much easier to develop those deep states of concentration if you don't have many distractions around you, if there are not many people around you, if there isn't much socializing going on. So if you can be by yourself in a remote place that is quite quiet, and where there are not many sense impressions that impinge on you and that distract you, then obviously it's much easier to develop concentration. On the other hand, if you're just still working with your defilements and you haven't actually reached those deep jhana states yet, then it can be quite difficult. And one of the things that can easily come up if you go into the wilderness by yourself is fear and dread, because obviously you're still quite attached to your body and to your life. And if you're alone in the wilderness, you have nobody to protect you. If something goes wrong, there's nobody there to look after you. And there can be wild animals, and obviously people can also be very scared of ghosts and other invisible beings. So that is what the Brahmin asked about. Isn't it really difficult to go into the wilderness and practice seclusion there? And the Brahmin asks, remote jungle thicket resting places in the forest are hard to endure. Seclusion is hard to practice, and it is hard to enjoy solitude. One would think the jungles must rob a bhikkhu of his mind if he has no concentration. And then the Buddha says, yes, it's true. It's very easy to be fearful when you're alone in seclusion. And then the Buddha gives a whole list of possible causes for fear to arise, various defilements in the mind. And we went through that list last time, and we saw that all these are things we can contemplate and that we can have a look at. And if there's a lot of fear in our mind, that usually means that one or more of those points are dominant in our mind, and we have those defilements present, and then we can work with those specific defilements, let them go, and as a result, the fear will also vanish. So there were things like sila that isn't properly developed, so ethical conduct that isn't properly developed, or the 5 hindrances, or various other qualities that are helpful for practice that haven't been fully developed yet. So we went through that last time, and the Buddha said, if you let go of those defilements and you develop those qualities, then actually you can find great solace dwelling in the forest. So the Buddha said, it actually does become very, very pleasant. So once your mind gets pure and bright and those defilements are abandoned, then obviously being in solitude is really, really pleasant because you can enjoy those deep states of meditation and you're not constantly being distracted, and obviously you're not constantly under the sway of those defilements that cause so much suffering. And that is up to the point where we read last time, and today we will continue at this point. In Bhikkhu Bodhi's translation, this is paragraph 20, and I put a link in the live chat, so if you want to read along, then you can. And so let's just continue with the sutta and read on. And the Buddha then keeps on talking about his practice, what he did in order to overcome fear and dread. And he says, I considered thus, there are the specially auspicious nights of the 14th, the 15th, and the 8th of the fortnight. Now, what if on such nights as these, I were to dwell in such awe-inspiring, horrifying abodes as orchard shrines, woodland shrines, and tree shrines? Perhaps I might encounter that fear and dread. And later, on such specially auspicious nights as the 14th, the 15th, and the 8th of the fortnight, I dwelt in such awe-inspiring, horrifying abodes as orchard shrines, woodland shrines, and tree shrines. And while I dwelt there, a wild animal would come up to me, or a peacock would knock off a branch, or the wind would rustle the leaves. I thought, what now if this is the fear and dread coming? I thought, why do I dwell always expecting fear and dread? What if I subdue that fear and dread while keeping the same posture that I am in when it comes upon me? So now we see that the Buddha really wants to practice overcoming fear. So he's going especially to those places that induce fear. So he's going especially to those places where he doesn't actually want to be in, the places that feel dangerous, the places where the fear is definitely going to come up, in order to be able to practice with it. So he isn't trying to avoid the situation, he is facing the situation head on, and then let the fear come and see what happens and investigate, and then eventually overcome this. And so here, the first thing that the Buddha mentions are the especially auspicious nights of the 14th, the 15th, and the 8th of the fortnight. So a fortnight is a period of 2 weeks. And obviously in ancient India, they were using a lunar calendar, so a calendar based on the moon phases. And so one moon phase from one full moon to another full moon obviously is about 29 days roughly. And so you can divide that up into the period from between a full moon and a new moon. That would be around 14 to 15 days. And then obviously right in the middle, there is the half moon, and that would be on the 8th day. And for that reason, the Buddha is talking about the 14th and the 15th day, because sometimes the period from between a full moon and a new moon, or a new moon and the next full moon, can be either 14 or 15 days. And then the 8th day means the half moon day. And so it was quite common in ancient cultures to think that those special days, such as the new moon, the full moon, half moons, or also special days that have to do with the sun, such as solstices or equinoxes, and such like, astronomical kind of dates that have to do with the positioning of stars, the positioning of planets, of the sun, the moon, and so on, that those have impacts on the life on Earth, and especially that those have impact on the spirits, the devas, and beings on other planes of existence. And it was believed quite commonly, not only in ancient India, but also, for example, in ancient European cultures, that on such special days, the veil between the worlds is quite thin, so a lot of spirits and ghosts would wander around in those nights. So that's why those nights are especially horrifying, because there would be especially many ghosts around. So I'm not sure if that is true. I don't have personal experience with that, but a lot of cultures believe this. So maybe there's something to it. I don't really know, but it is possible. And anyway, so on those particularly horrifying nights, the Buddha would go to places where you would be likely to encounter such spirits. So the Buddha here mentions orchard shrines, woodland shrines, and tree shrines. I think to us that doesn't sound particularly horrifying. I think that sounds quite lovely, going to a nice orchard or a tree or something. Obviously, in Western countries, we don't really have those kind of shrines. If you go to Asia, you can still see them quite commonly. So, for example, you would see a very big ancient tree that is quite large, with a lot of foliage and spanning over a large area, basically providing a lot of shade. And under that tree, usually people would set up a small altar, and maybe they would put some kind of Buddha image there, or they would put an image of some kind of Hindu deity there. And often they would put some garlands there, some flowers. They would decorate the tree with a few flags maybe, or some kind of cloth strips. And you can often see people just putting little offerings there, a few candles, maybe some incense, maybe a few flowers, or a little bit of food. And it's quite a common sight in many Asian countries, even nowadays, that people would go and worship such tree shrines or woodland shrines and so on. Even in cities, if you have a big tree in the city, even there it can still happen. You can still see that quite commonly. So that practice is still very much alive in Asia. And often that is associated with there being a local guardian deity or some kind of local guardian spirit living in that tree or living in that particular woodland area. And so in Buddhist terms, those local deities are usually considered to be yakas. Yakas are earthbound deities that are just a little bit above the human plane in terms of rebirth. So in terms of their mental development, they're quite similar to humans. So they are a little bit higher. They have been reborn in a low deva realm, but they still have a lot of defilements. And those yakas can also be quite violent. And so for that reason, they're quite powerful and they can be quite violent. So for that reason, people would like to have a good relationship with them, to placate them, and to give them offerings. And for that reason, they are considered dangerous places, because if that spirit is upset, then it could cause some kind of problems. And for that reason, it's believed that those places are horrifying places if you go there at night, because the spirit might get annoyed that you're there and that you're intruding in their space, and might take some action. And so the Buddha is especially going there because that is considered dangerous, and he wants to explore the fear and dread that is coming up, and he wants to work with that and learn how to overcome that. So he is specifically trying to trigger that fear and dread. And he's going to the most dangerous place so that the highest amount of fear would come up, so that he has a lot to work with. If you go only to a mildly dangerous place, obviously you would always doubt, if I went to a more dangerous place, would I still be able to overcome the fear? But if you go to the most dangerous place and you're able to work with the fear, then obviously you have worked with the maximum amount of fear that can be there. So, and then he is there and he's meditating there, or dwelling there, probably meditating, I assume. And then, as you can imagine, forests are not entirely quiet. Wild animals roam around, even if there's no spirit. or yaka, or dangerous deva. A wild animal can walk around, or there's the wind that is rustling the leaves. And so you can imagine if you sit there, you try to meditate, but you're already very tense and very fearful, then the smallest kind of noise can trigger you and can bring up this full-on panic attack, because you don't know what it is dark, and there's nobody around to help you. And I think most people can sort of understand that kind of feeling, or have felt that before. And there are so many, like for those of you who have read like biographies of the ancient Thai forest teachers, for example, Ajahn Chah, or the stories that Ajahn Brahm always tells, you know that all those teachers that later on went on to become famous arahants, or famous, like reported to be arahants, I don't know, and famous teachers, all went through these kind of periods where they practiced in this way. So Ajahn Brahm, for example, tells the story where he was meditating out in the forest in Thailand, and exactly the same situation. It was dark, and there was this rustling noise behind him, and it sounded like an animal was coming, and he was absolutely convinced that there was a tiger coming, and he was about to die, and he was full on panic mode. And then when he turned around, it was actually a mouse. And we all know how our mind can, when there's fear in the mind, everything can be taken completely out of proportion, and how we misperceive danger, things that are not actually dangerous as danger, or things that are slightly dangerous as much more dangerous than they actually are. Or there's the story where Ajahn Chah went to a cemetery, or to a charnel ground, or like a corpse burning ground that they still had in Thailand at that time when he was young. And he went there to practice at night. And usually, if you want to spend a night at a cemetery, the recommended practice is that you go there when it is still light, so at some point in the afternoon, and you try to remember the layout of the place. You try to remember where the trees are, where the graves are, and so on, so you can find your way around when it's dark. But he didn't know that, and he went there when it was already getting dark. And so he just prepared his mat, and then he went and did some walking meditation, and it really got dark. And then out of the corner of his eye, he saw this massive figure looming very close to him, and it seemed like with outstretched arms, it was coming for him with its long claws, and he absolutely panicked. And but he did also follow the Buddha's advice then, and just kept on doing walking meditation in the same way that the Buddha here says. He kept the same posture to subdue the fear and dread. Ajahn Chah did the same, and just kept on walking, and the figure was just looming there next to his path, but didn't come closer. And so because he was so panicked, he just kept on walking the whole night and didn't sit down at all, or didn't lay down to sleep at all. And the next morning, when it got light again, then he noticed that it was just a tree. And the fear and dread and the panic had just made him believe that there was some kind of dangerous spirit coming for him. So that is quite common. Anyway, since all these kind of encounters can trigger fear and dread, we have an opportunity then to work with them once they are present in the mind. And then the Buddha asked himself the question, why do I dwell always expecting fear and dread? So why is it that the smallest things, like the wind rustling the leaves, or like as animals just like walking by or something, why does that trigger all this fear in us? Why are we so tense? Why does this feeling of panic rise up so easily? So what are the causes for that fear and dread? What is the attachment? What are we clinging to? What can we not let go that makes us have all this fear and dread? And obviously we cling to the body, we cling to our life. We are afraid of death, we are afraid of pain, we are afraid of being injured, but especially we are afraid of dying, and we are afraid of losing this body. And obviously, if we were further on the path, if we had reached anagamiship, so non-return, then we would have overcome all attachment to the body already. And at that point, we would also have overcome or fear, because once we are no longer afraid of dying, and once we are no longer afraid of anything happening to this body, which is not our body in the first place, which we just mistake as ours, as me or mine, once we overcome that, there's no longer any fear present in the mind, because since there is no clinging to the body, there cannot be any fear. We don't need to protect the body. So then the Buddha says he practiced he practiced subduing the fear while keeping the same posture that he was in when it comes upon me. And then he elaborates a little bit more on this point, and he says, while I walked, the fear and dread came upon me. I neither stood nor sat nor lay down till I had subdued that fear and dread. While I stood, the fear and dread came upon me. I neither walked nor sat down, nor sat nor lay down till I had subdued that fear and dread. While I sat, the fear and dread came upon me. I neither walked nor stood nor lay down till I had subdued that fear and dread. While I lay down, the fear and dread came upon me. I neither walked nor stood nor sat down till I had subdued that fear and dread. So this is just a description of the Buddha. Whatever posture he was in, when he noticed that fear and dread arose in his mind, he would just keep on doing exactly the same thing until he had mentally overcome that fear and dread. So if he did walking meditation, he would just keep on walking, no matter how long it took. Could take hours, obviously, could take longer, even days, maybe, I don't know. Or if he was sitting, he would just keep on sitting. Or if he was lying down, he would just keep on lying down, just to make sure that the mind doesn't get distracted. Obviously, when we have a lot of fear present in the mind, fear makes us very restless. We want to jump up. We want to do other things. Often in daily life, we have these kind of irrational fears, and we don't really want to confront them. So we try everything to distract us. For example, we go to Netflix and watch a movie, or we go to the fridge and see what's in there, or we just randomly eat some stuff, or anything to distract us so that we don't have to actually look at our mind and see what is there and actually confront the fear. But the Buddha is doing exactly that. He is confronting the fear head on. He doesn't let himself be distracted. So he just keeps on walking, he just keeps on sitting. And obviously, in order to overcome the fear, you need to investigate. So that's his meditation practice. So you need to understand what are the causes for the fear, why is the fear coming up. Usually, as I mentioned, it's attachment to the body, attachment to life, feeling threatened. And then obviously, cultivating right view, understanding about non-self, especially the non-self nature of our body, understanding that death is a natural part of life. These kind of reflections that can really help us overcome the fear, but it does take time. And so the Buddha says, however long it took, he just kept on practicing until it was finally gone. And then the Buddha continues. There are some recluses and Brahmins who perceive day when it is night and night when it is day. I say that on their part, this is an abiding in delusion. But I perceive night when it is night and day when it is day. Rightly speaking, were it to be said of anyone, a being not subject to delusion has appeared in the world for the welfare and happiness of many, out of compassion for the world, for the good welfare and happiness of gods and humans. It is of me, indeed, that rightly speaking, this could be said. So now here is a paragraph that doesn't seem to be properly integrated with the rest of the sutta. It has nothing to do with fear and dread. It's not at all connected to the paragraph before that we just read. It's not at all connected to the next paragraph. So it seems that it is a bit misplaced in the sutta. Maybe that this is a transmission error. Not sure why this is there, so we're just going to ignore this. So obviously, the statement is true. Obviously, the Buddha is not subject to delusion, and he has appeared in the world for the welfare and happiness of many. However, it has nothing to do with his practice of this fear and dread or overcoming fear and dread. So we're just going to leave that to one side and move on. And then the Buddha says, tireless energy was aroused in me, and unremitting mindfulness was established. My body was tranquil and untroubled, my mind concentrated and unified. So now we see that this next paragraph ties in very nicely with the paragraph we read before, where the Buddha says you practiced just keeping the same posture until the fear and dread was subdued. And so again, that seems to show us that this other paragraph about the Buddha not having any delusions maybe was a later insertion that accidentally somehow was moved there. So because the paragraph before says that he just kept the posture and until he overcome the fear, and then this paragraph now says he had tireless energy aroused and his mindfulness was unremitting. His body was tranquil and untroubled and his mind became concentrated. So obviously this tireless energy refers to the practice that he did, where he really just kept the posture until the fear was over, no matter how long it took. So that's kind of the tireless energy that the Buddha talks about here. And of course, unremitting mindfulness was established. So of course, if you want to do this kind of practice, you really have to have very strong mindfulness. Otherwise, you will just get carried away by the fear. So if you go to the place that will really, really trigger your fear, you need to have good mindfulness to actually work with the fear. Otherwise, the fear will just run rampant in your mind and you will not get a handle of that at all. Because the emotion is just so strong. If your mindfulness isn't strong, then you can't really work with it. But if your mindfulness is strong, it's kind of like a tug of war. The fear is pulling you into to one side. The mindfulness is pulling you back. The fear is just pulling you, trying to get your mind to go into panic mode. And the mindfulness is just trying to get your mind to remain calm and peaceful and investigate what's going on. So it's just a back and forth until you're really strong enough to let go of the fear. And then your mind will become entirely peaceful and tranquil. And so as the Buddha subdues this fear, his body becomes tranquil and untroubled, and the mind becomes concentrated and unified. So obviously, since these very strong defilements have now been overcome, the mind can enter into deep states of samadhi. So what we are seeing here is the Buddha really practicing right effort. I think we all know that sometimes meditation practice can be a bit of a struggle. Of course, everybody thinks of meditation. They think your mind is peaceful and blissful and it's just a relaxing, but most practitioners would know that it's not the case always, or is not even most of the times. Most of the times we have defilements there and we just find skillful means to work with those defilements. And the periods where we can actually get into deep meditation are comparatively less, as long as we haven't really properly overcome the 5 hindrances. But here now, the Buddha obviously has developed the right effort. He has overcome the fear, and he now goes into deep stages of samadhi. And now what follows is the stock passage of the 4 jhanas, so quite secluded from sensual pleasures, secluded from unwholesome states, and so on. He enters the 1st jhana, then he enters the 2nd, the 3rd, the 4th. We have talked about jhanas many times before, so we're going to skip that today. And then the Buddha, again, there's the stock passages where the Buddha develops the 3 knowledges, the Te-Vijja. These are knowledges that you develop just before arahantship. The first one is seeing one's past lives with all the details, hundreds of thousands of lives back in time. The second one is insight into karma and rebirth, how good karma leads to good rebirth, how bad karma leads to bad rebirth. That's the second direct insight or direct knowledge. And then the third true knowledge or direct knowledge is, of course, the understanding of the 4 noble truths and the understanding of the destruction of the taints. So the full liberation of the mind, which is the liberation of the arahant. So that is the third direct knowledge. Again, we have talked about these many times before. These are stock passages, and we're going to skip those today. So now the Buddha, after the Buddha has overcome all the fear and dread, entered into samadhi states, then went through those wisdom, developments of wisdom, which are the three knowledges. Now he is an arahant. And then we continue reading at paragraph 33, where the Buddha says, "This was the third true knowledge attained by me in the last watch of the night. Ignorance was banished and true knowledge arose. Darkness was banished and light arose, as happens in one who abides diligent, ardent, and resolute." So again, the Buddha says that all these developments are based on practicing diligent, ardent, and resolute. So again, the Buddha refers back to right effort. The effort, sometimes it takes a lot of effort to practice meditation. Sometimes meditation isn't pleasant and it's not peaceful. Sometimes we really have to face our defilements head on, and it is a struggle. And our mindfulness is basically fighting with the defilements. Just trying to keep our mind clear and peaceful so that we can actually investigate those defilements that are in our mind so that we can develop wisdom. So that right effort is really very fundamental in order to work with fear, in order to work with any defilement, but here especially to work with fear. And then the Buddha continues and he says, "Now, Brahmin, it might be that you think, perhaps the recluse Gautama is not free from lust, hate, and delusion, even today, which is why he still resorts to remote jungle thicket resting places in the forest. But you should not think thus. It is because I see two benefits that I still resort to remote jungle thicket resting places in the forest. I see a pleasant abiding for myself here and now, and I have compassion for future generations." So then the Buddha says, well, the Buddha still goes to the forest and he still practices in the forest in seclusion. And so maybe some people might misunderstand him going there and practicing there. And maybe some people think, oh, he is not fully enlightened. He still has greed, hatred, and delusion in his mind. And so he still needs to cultivate right effort further, and he still needs to work on those defilements further. And for that reason, he goes into seclusion. But so the Buddha says, if you think thus, that would be wrong. The Buddha is fully enlightened. Obviously, he has let go of all the defilements. So he has no longer any need to actually go into seclusion in order to work with the defilements. But he goes there for two other reasons. He still sees two benefits for going into seclusion. And the first one, obviously, is that it is a pleasant abiding for himself. So he can practice jhana there because it's a quiet environment. There is nothing to distract him. It's very easy. If you have developed your mind in that way, very easy to get into jhana. And we have seen before, the Buddha also repeatedly stating that for somebody whose mind is undeveloped, the forest can be fearful. But for somebody whose mind is developed, they can find great solace in the forest. So being alone, being by yourself becomes really, really pleasant when you have overcome some of the hindrances. I think even nowadays, I think even people who are not arahants, even most of us can easily understand that being alone by yourself can be very pleasant. Being with other people can sometimes be very tiring, can be very distracting. Your mindfulness isn't very strong because there's so much going on and all the people are talking to you, and you're just so drawn into the world, into the outside, that it's very difficult to be focused and centered and to keep mindfulness established. But if you're by yourself, then obviously that all is much, much easier. So, and then the second reason why the Buddha still goes to the forest is that he has compassion for future generations. And so that means, obviously, future generations or the next generation of practitioners, they always look to the generation before, to the older monks and nuns, to the older practitioners, and in the Buddha's time, obviously, to the Buddha himself, to see how they practice, and then they would just follow their example and practice in the same way. So if the Buddha just hangs out in the cities the whole time and talks with people, or if the Buddha says, well, I have nothing further to do, so basically I can just hang out on the beach all the time and eat ice cream, then obviously the next generation doesn't know what to do. And then if they follow the Buddha's example, they will never develop any kind of higher stages of the mind. Because obviously if the Buddha doesn't show them the way, then they wouldn't know what to do. And this, again, this refers back to the very first question that the Brahmin Janusoni asked the Buddha, where he asked the Buddha if his disciples take him as their leader, their helper, and their guide, and if they follow his example. So, and then the Buddha confirms, yes, they take me as their leader and guide, and they follow my example. So for that reason, the Buddha has to set the example, and he has to actually go to the forest so that other practitioners will also go into seclusion and can then have good conditions to work with their defilements. So out of compassion, the Buddha also goes into the forest. And then now we see again how this first question of the Brahmin Janusoni wasn't totally random and out of place. It actually refers back to the end of the sutta, or the end of the sutta refers back to the first question, and it just forms one perfect cycle, and it all makes sense at the end. And then the Brahmin Janusoni is now very happy, and he says, indeed, it is because Master Gotama is an accomplished one, a fully enlightened one, that he has compassion for future generations. Magnificent Master Gotama, magnificent Master Gotama. Master Gotama has made the Dhamma clear in many ways, as though he were turning upright what had been overthrown, revealing what was hidden, showing the way to one who was lost, or holding up a lamp in the dark for those with eyesight to see forms. I go to Master Gotama for refuge, and to the Dhamma and to the Sangha of bhikkhus. From today, let Master Gotama remember me as a lay follower who has gone to him for refuge for life. So this is the Bhayabherava Sutta, the Sutta on fear and dread. I hope you got some ideas for your own practice if you're struggling with fear and dread sometimes. So now if you have any questions, please post them in the live chat. I see a few comments or questions already. So let's see if I can answer them. Okay, so hello everyone. Nice to see so many people checking in. So this is just a comment, not a question, from Rick. And they say, thank you, Ayya, for your generosity in offering the Dhamma online. This sutta is especially helpful during this time in my life. I'm really glad that this helps. And I think at the moment, as I mentioned in the beginning, a lot of people are struggling with fear and anxiety and so on. So you're probably not alone. And hopefully some of the strategies that were discussed here in this sutta that the Buddha mentioned might be helpful for you. And good luck with your practice. And then there is Richard. And Richard says, thank you for this very insightful sutta study, Ayya. Before, I unconsciously assumed that fear was a derivative of delusion, being a mind construct. What is the difference between fear and delusion? Well, so I think eventually, like at the very core, all the defilements are rooted in delusion. So in that sense, you can say definitely fear is a derivative of delusion, but in the same way, greed is a derivative of delusion. Because when we are greedy, we don't see reality as it actually is, and we don't really understand that the things that we are greedy for are not really desirable. Or hate is a derivative of delusion, because hate or anger doesn't make any sense once we understand that there is no self there. And so anger, it has no basis whatsoever. So all the defilements in the end are derivatives of delusion, including fear, of course. Still, sometimes it can be helpful not to just talk about delusion, but to actually break it down into the various other emotions that we feel: greed, hatred, fear, some of the others. Sometimes we even talk specifically about subgroups of greed, subgroups of hatred, for example, anger or envy, or any of the other kinds of, or even conceit, for example, all the various other kinds of defilements. So it can be helpful to just, focus on one subgroup, or just to focus on as we have done here when we focus on fear. So the difference is just that fear is one derivative of delusion, but there are many others, such as greed, such as hatred, and so on. And then there is Rick with another question. Is this the same Rick that had a question before? Yeah, okay. So another question from Rick. And they say, how do we differentiate between prudent fears and imagined fears so we can act skillfully? Thank you. So I think at first, obviously, this is a question everybody has to answer for themselves, because what is a prudent fear for one person can be an imagined fear for someone else. So it depends very much on your upbringing. It depends very much on your surrounding. It depends very much on even your gender. Some things are dangerous for women that might not be as dangerous for men, or even the other way around. There can be the things that are dangerous in one part of the world, but not in another part of the world. So for example, if you live, such as myself, if you live in Germany, then being fearful of tigers doesn't really make much sense. If you live in a forest kuti in a place that actually has tigers, then obviously that makes a bit more sense. Or if you're fearful of poisonous snakes, the place where I live, there are no poisonous snakes. So if I walk in the forest and I see a snake, I don't have to be afraid. But if I walk in Sri Lanka in the forest and I see a snake, then that is a reasonable fear. So it really depends from person to person. So we have to develop a little bit of wisdom ourselves. Also, as I mentioned in the beginning, nowadays a lot of people have social anxieties. Often that is an imagined fear. Often people around us are not actually dangerous. But for some people, they live in actually unsafe situations and where people around them are actually violent. So in that case, obviously, it's not an imagined fear. It's actually a very real threat. So kind of develop your own wisdom. Sort of just when fear comes up, try to understand, what am I fearful of at the moment? Is that a rational fear? Is that an irrational fear? And then act accordingly, skillfully, especially if the fear is irrational or imagined. It can be quite helpful to just confront the fear. For example, if you are fearful of spiders and you see a spider, and spiders are not usually dangerous. In most parts of the world, again, if you're in Australia, there can be very dangerous spiders, for example. But if it's a non-dangerous spider, then maybe you can just touch it gently, or if touching is too dangerous, if it's too difficult, then just gently catch it somehow and take it outside. So confront the fear, work with the fear so that it sort of slowly diminishes. But then as we develop more on the path, like if you want to go really, really, really very deep on the path, we have to understand that eventually all fears are imagined fears or are irrational fears, because this body doesn't belong to us. This body isn't our body. It's just a body. And this life is going to come to an end eventually anyway. So death is unavoidable. So even the fear of death or the clinging to this body eventually is a defilement, and we have to let that go. So obviously that is for quite advanced practitioners. So in the beginning, it does definitely make sense to differentiate between prudent fears and imagined fears. But as we go deeper, we have to let go of all kinds of fears. And also, like when we reflect, obviously, while fear is there, our mind isn't free. So if we have fear, just because we have fear, it doesn't really help us in any way. Like, for example, we live with fear, and that causes a lot of suffering. So it's very, very painful to live with fear all the time, especially if the fear is imagined. So it would be much better if we could dissolve that, if we could let that go. And then if there are real dangers, like even for an arahant can still take steps to protect their body, for example. They don't necessarily just ignore their body and let it die. But they don't act out of fear, they act out of wisdom. So we can wisely assess a danger and then take appropriate steps without needing to resort to fear. So we can replace fear with wisdom, and then in that way also protect our body and protect our life. That would be a much more skillful way to deal with such situations. And then a person has a question that is not at all connected to today's sutta, asking if I have been to Nepal. And no, I have not been to Nepal. And that seems to be the last question for today, I think. So I hope you all enjoyed this sutta. I hope it was helpful for you. I hope you all have some strategies to work with fear now, or some wise reflections to work with fear. And we will finish for today with 3 sadhus. Feel free to join if you like. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. And I will see you all next Tuesday. Have a good rest of the day and have a good week.